Good, and I think this is the sign for us to start. So let me officially welcome you to our February web debate. After a bit of a break in January, we're now back with full force. As you know, the web debate is part of a series that is organized by Diplo Foundation in the framework of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. My name is Katharina Höhne. I'm a research associate in diplomacy and global governance with Diplo Foundation, and I will be moderating today. So today we have quite a formidable question before us, which is, what is the potential of big data for diplomacy? In a sense, data is everywhere, or rather, we leave data footprints everywhere. Some have said that data is the new oil and about to become a geostrategic resource. Modern society definitely seems to be marked by it. Data is continuously generated through various devices, on social media, through the electronic documents we generate, or satellite images. This has led some to say that we now have entered the big data era, and to kind of talk about big data as a distinct category. Big data has become a topic for the private sector, promising greater efficiency and new business insights. But the private sector is not diplomacy. So we need to ask, what is the potential of big data for diplomacy? How should foreign ministries adapt? And I think these are formidable questions, no matter if you are an enthusiast of new technology and big data in particular, or if you are a critic. This web debate also aims to give an overview of a new Diplo report and our reasons for engaging with the topic. The title of the report is Data Diplomacy, Updating Diplomacy to the Big Data Era, and it was commissioned by the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This web debate, in this sense, marks the soft launch of the report, with the official launch following in 2 days in Geneva. So this is literally the first glimpse of the contents of the report. And we will invite you to discuss some of the key themes of the report with us. In order to do so, we have Ms. Barbara Rosen-Jacobsen with us. She is a program manager at Diplo Foundation and the Geneva Internet Platform. Together with Joran Kubalia and myself, she is one of the authors of the report, and she will give us a first overview of some of its insights. We are also very proud to have Mr. Ossi Piironen with us. He's a member of the Policy Planning and Research Unit in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, and he will add insights from the practitioner's perspective, and he will also explain some of the reasoning behind commissioning the report and some of the expectations associated with it. But before I give the floor to Ossi for his brief introduction, I would like to remind you that we welcome your questions. Please feel free to leave them in the chat window, which is located on the left side of your screen. And then I will relate the questions to the speakers. Ossi will have to leave at past, so I suggest we focus the first hour of our debate on his interventions and questions for him, which again is all the more reason to please do not hold back and engage in a rich dialogue with us. But I think now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Ossi for his brief introduction.
Okay, thank you, Katharina. This is a bit exciting because this is the first time I'm participating in this kind of a web debate, but I will do my best. So, I was asked to say a couple of words about the reasons of the Finnish MFA to commission the project on data diplomacy, and I'm certainly quite glad to do that. First of all, I must say it must be said that for us this is not a one-off venture into looking the connections between technological developments and diplomatic activities and foreign policy in general. Before this excellent collaboration with you, the Diplo Foundation, we made a rather successful cooperation with the Dutch Klingendale Institute. First in 2012, the Institute published a report titled Futures of Diplomacy. And of course the scope went much beyond technology. It discussed, for example, the development of diplomatic processes and practices more generally, changing communications patterns, organization of foreign services, and the growing number of non-state actors. But this report did also pay attention to the technological transformations, and it did, for example, propose setting up virtual embassies and developing further e-diplomacy and practices related to that. And perhaps related to this e-diplomacy, the authors also suggested that foreign ministries and individual diplomats should make better use of social media. And social media at that point, or should I say long ago, had made its breakthrough into the working life. But maybe we diplomats are a bit slow to woke up for this kind of activities. Anyway, the message was that diplomats cannot detach themselves from foreign policy discussions, otherwise the public agenda will be set by others. And today we certainly know that this was a pretty wise piece of advice, and to great extent foreign ministries have developed their communication strategies to meet these requirements of the day. Well, the other report was titled Diplomacy in the Digital Age, and this focused directly on the implications of technology and digitalization in diplomatic affairs. And this study identified big data as something that we had to recognize. And the authors concluded that while gathering information may become easier for foreign ministries, processing and analyzing data will become much more complex. And I find even this conclusion quite relevant for our current discussions. There seems to be quite a lot new data sources, that is for sure, but the real challenge is to make even a fraction of this data useful, to make it matter. And I will come back to this quite soon. But anyway, after the big data was identified as something that we should take a more closer look at, we were quite ready to hook up with you, the Diplo Foundation, as you seem to be interested in developing the pretty same set of questions that occupied our minds here in Helsinki. In a nutshell, we wanted to get some flesh on the bones, to really examine what on earth was the fuss about the big data. How would it affect diplomacy and the work of foreign ministries? And for sure, if there were concrete examples that some ministries or other foreign policy actors like international organizations were already exploiting somehow these new types of data sources or new types of data analysis, we definitely wanted to hear about these experiences. And I think that it has turned out that people all over Europe meddling with foreign policy were pretty much sharing similar thoughts and asking similar questions. And I think that this has become evident in the seminars that have been organized by the project. So clearly there has been demand for this kind of discussion and analysis. Now, during the process we have learned that there are, in fact, some occasions in which new types of data have been put into use by foreign policy actors. We have learned that there are some attempts to even institutionalize the collection and analysis of new data sources within certain organizations. But even so, the strongest impression that I have, and I'm not sure if Barbara and Katarina will agree, is that new data sources are not utilized as widely and effectively as all the hype and sometimes quite strong rhetoric would make us to think. So all in all, with this project, I think we have been making progress in starting to understand the phenomenon of big data. We are, at least here in Helsinki, now more capable to realistically assess the potential and the limits of using the new data sources. And what comes to the report that will be published on Thursday, I have had the privilege to read some of the earlier drafts. I can recommend it, especially to those who have not yet had the time to really think about the consequences of digitalization and datafication, how they may affect foreign policy making and diplomatic affairs. So this report should give a nice jump start to making sense of much that has been going on for some time now. Katarina,
if you want to, but we also have a couple of questions. So if you have more to add, maybe you can take 1 or 2, 3 minutes, but we can also go to questions. It is up to you.
If it's okay, I could say a couple of words about what I think about talking about big data, if that's okay. All right. So, I think that to be able to understand the discussion on big data is to understand that in fact we are talking about the phenomenon. We are not talking about a type of data. So to me, big data is a phenomenon. It's not a type of data or a type of data source. And Katarina, you talked about big data era. That's another way to put it, I guess. So big data for me, it describes a phenomenon more or less built upon the process of digitalization. And the concept is meant to merely point out that there is an increasing amount of data that comes in widely varying formats. And this data is scattered into a multiplicity of locations. And of course, additionally, it may also imply that because of increased connectivity and capacity to storage and process this raw material, we have real possibilities to put some of it into use for our benefit. But then comes the important part. It seems to me that the data and data sources are so diverse that it rarely actually makes sense to talk about the big data, the phenomenon. And even more, much of the actual data that we associate with the big data is in fact pretty conventional. For example, registry-based microdata of various kinds, on which we have had access for years, basically. But of course, with technological and methodological innovations, we have now better capabilities to combine and analyze even very large data sets. But many times, to collect this scattered data and to process it for use, is quite difficult and expensive. So at least for the time being, I assume that the production of reliable datasets and reliable analysis of existing data with a broad, perhaps international scope will be dependent on capable organizations and individuals with access and authority. And I'm thinking data on trade, traffic, elections, environment, for example. So overall, I do not see a revolution here, but more like an evolution. But of course, there are relatively new types of data too. We have web-based logs, social media profiles, and geospatial data, for example. And some of these do have real foreign policy consequences, and they have real foreign policy uses too. So there is no denying that it is quite justified for the MFAs to focus on these. But I think that the report makes clear that, and I'm sorry to disclose this, Barbara and Katarina, there are very good reasons to stay realistic with the opportunities that even these new data sources may offer. And the prospects seem somewhat limited for various reasons, related perhaps to accessibility and reliability and comparability and etc. So as a rule of thumb, one could probably say that whereas certain sources, data sources may be of high value, others will not. And I would be very careful when talking about big data. We don't use big data, but merely various types of data. And some of this data are from new data sources, or relatively new data sources. Okay, I think.
Thank you, Ossi. I think that was a very important reminder
Thank you for listening.
Being realistic, kind of having the head a bit in the clouds, but also keeping the feet firmly on the ground. And just looking at the chat and what's happening there. So you had this wonderful, I'm almost tempted to say metaphor, where you said big data is certainly not a revolution for diplomacy, but it is more of an evolution. And then you also answered or addressed one of the questions that came up in the chat, which is, so if we're talking about big data, what is big data actually? And you had a very interesting answer that, again, we have to be cautious. There's no point in following the hype, but we also have to be very clear about what we actually mean when we're talking about big data. And that's also a question I would like to bring in my colleague Barbara, because I know this is a question we have thought about a lot and we have wrestled with a lot, because some of the existing literature has a very certain perspective which we engage with critically. So I would like to invite Barbara to say a few words on this point of, so what are we talking about when we're talking about big data?
Thank you, Katarina. Yes, we had a lot of discussions on, first of all, what do we mean with big data? And second, what does data diplomacy mean? And well, data diplomacy is something that we kind of came up with, and there is not really an established definition yet. Big data has maybe the opposite problem, that there is so much talk about big data, but there's no agreed upon approach or definition that is widely used. It's also a bit of a turf battle, I think, that everyone wants to define big data in the way that they can profit from it, basically. So we looked kind of at two dimensions of big data. One, what kind of source of data is it? What kind of data? So we, although it is difficult to draw a line between what is big data and what is not, we looked at the size of data sets, the heterogeneous characteristics that were already pointed out by Ossi, the fact that it usually requires tools that were previously not available yet to process and analyze this data. But on the other hand, we also looked at what big data does and why it is something different, why it produces something different than before. So we looked at how can it provide trends and correlations and patterns that can be useful in the analysis for foreign policy, for example. Concretely, because we did need some sort of concrete input for our research, we looked at 4 kinds of data. So we looked at sensor data. For example, this is GPS data from mobile phones. We looked at web data, so for example, social media data or web scrapers. We looked at geospatial and satellite data, which is maybe an older form of big data. And we also looked at textual data because it is such an important source of information for diplomats. And here, for example, transcripts are very important. Conference transcripts, for example, that can be analyzed, or reports, or consultations. There are a lot of texts that are generated and that can be analyzed for diplomacy. So hopefully this answers a little bit the question of what is big data and what kind of data are we looking at.
Before I give the floor back to Ossi for further comments, there's another really interesting question that I would like to bring in. It comes from Ambassador Stefano Baldi, who used to be the head of training of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so he has a question that is basically related to that, which is, are diplomats ready and equipped to manage data, including big data? And if I may say, in the report, we're basically trying to highlight what are the steps that have already been taken and what can be done to achieve this. But to relate a question back to our speakers, maybe also you can speak from your experience in the Finnish ministry, and then giving the floor back to Barbara, maybe you can add just a few of the recommendations we have made in the report.
Okay, first of all, I think when I look at my ministry, the use for new data sources is quite minimal. It is our communications department that is perhaps the most advanced in this respect. They have commissioned sentiment and network analysis based on social media data. And as far as I know, they also have some basic tools for monitoring the social media visibility of Finnish foreign policy actors. But that's about it. So one could say that the use for this kind of data is quite minimal, and even more, it has been commissioned outside from the house. It's true that we do not have the resources to really go to the expert level. We don't have this kind of expertise in the house currently. Of course, it's a different matter whether this should, in the future, whether this should be developed further. But actually, one of the points that I wanted to make is that I don't believe that that we need, at least in the immediate near future, to become experts. I have a hunch, I have a feeling that most of data collection and analysis will be done by others. Will be done by international organizations, will be done by for-profit firms, will be done by perhaps other government agencies, and even national statistics offices show interest in these new data sources, and they ponder how they might make use of them. And what comes to foreign policy related data, it's usually, the scope is international. If you want reliable, comparable data, you need to cooperate. And it's rarely so that one ministry in one country can actually provide meaningful data that we might use to support our day-to-day work. I believe in international organizations and the so-called traditional data and statistic producers. I think that they still have a role to play in this.
Thank you, Ossi. I think that's a very good clarification. But before I forget, Barbara, what are some of our insights regarding this point on are diplomats ready and equipped to manage data, including big data?
Yeah, well, our insight is mainly that often they are not yet equipped, but there are ways to become ready to capture the opportunities of big data that might not be as complicated and as frightening as it sometimes seems to be. First, maybe getting back to Ossi's point about the communications unit maybe already using big data. In fact, in our report, we mapped 4 areas of diplomacy that could benefit from big data: information gathering, negotiation, communication, public diplomacy, and consular affairs. And we also looked at the areas of trade, development, humanitarian affairs, and international law. So we did try to see across the board, not just consular affairs or communication, but across the board, where could big data fit in? And we did see potential in all of these areas to be better informed through big data. So that is why we thought when Ministry of Foreign Affairs considers adopting big data sources and analyzing big data sources, of course, one of the options is to source it out to other agencies or universities or consultants that might be able to do this. But a more sustainable way might be to establish a very small unit that comprises of data scientists and diplomats, or at least people who can make that bridge. This unit can have links to all the other units in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so that it's not just one department benefiting from analysis. And in fact, this is an approach that is already taken by a handful of ministries of foreign affairs that are experimenting with big data. And this is a little bit of a risk-free, more flexible environment for them. But of course, the key question then arises: how do you make diplomats and data scientists communicate effectively? Because although the analysis, of course, is conducted by data scientists, and we are not advocating for diplomats to become data scientists, it is still very important that diplomats know at least a little bit about what is possible and what is not with big data, what kind of data sources are out there, what is the kind of questions that should be asked to data scientists. So here we also look at capacity building and the kind of capacity building that is needed for diplomats that are maybe not directly touching the data, but are still working with data scientists and commissioning studies. Do you have anything to add, Katarina?
I think again, it's very important to have this balanced approach. For example, in the chat, Stefano Baldi just very much agreed with what has been said. He says, I believe the diplomats shall learn how to use this analysis and where to get the reliable analysis. And when to do this, you need knowledge. And even then, if you're not doing the analysis yourself, but only using results, you need knowledge and skills to judge what is appropriate and what you can actually do with that. And capacity building is a big part of the report. So we look at what is the kind of awareness raising that needs to happen first. And here we kind of recommend to lead by example. So the big data unit, the small big data unit that Barbara just talked about in the ministry, which should be free to innovate and should explore different, ideally should explore different avenues of using big data by basically developing very specific case studies. And this is one of the points you make about awareness raising. that we have to be careful not to fall into the hype. So it will be of big data. So it will be very important to really pinpoint by example, how can big data help the daily work of diplomats? How can big data contribute to what diplomats want to achieve, to their daily work, to their larger objectives? And here it is not enough to basically say that big data has some potential there. It needs to be shown by example. And we think that an experimental unit like the big data unit we recommend could do a lot here, because it is not about believing or not believing in something. It is about really concretely showing what is the potential of big data to foster the mission of the foreign ministry and where are the limits. Similarly, in terms of capacity building, we recommend 3 different levels of capacity building. A beginner's level, intermediate level, and expert level. So we're not saying everyone has to have the same skills. We're saying everyone needs to have, so to speak, a beginner's level awareness of big data, but depending on what diplomats actually work on, there might be different levels of skills that are needed. So it is very detailed in that sense, and it's a very cautious kind of step-by-step approach we're recommending. And having said that, I'm aware that Ossi needs to leave now, so I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for your contribution and for being with us today.
If you can still hear me, I cannot hear you anymore.
We will see you again in 2 days in Geneva. So if there are any more questions and interesting comments that will come up in the chat, I will update you in Geneva.
All right. Hey, thank you. It was very a privilege to talk with you today, and I hope to see you in a couple of days. Thank you.
Yeah, see you in 2 days. Thank you so much. Good. Moving on to, we talked a little bit about big data sources, about what can and what cannot be done, and how big data impacts on the functions of diplomacy. We had a question earlier by Yolanda Spies, which I could not bring into the discussion, but it really goes to this question of data sources, reliability of data. What are we talking about when we talk about big data, and maybe what is the distinction between that and normal data? So she asked, I'm wondering how much of big data could possibly be fake or planted. In an era of fake news, diplomats must surely be sensitive to the pitfalls. And I know this is something we also thought about a lot in terms of how is big data different from small data, especially in this regard of reliability.
We identified actually a couple of points that need to be borne in mind when thinking about conducting a big data analysis in the context of diplomacy. And one of these issues is exactly the quality of the data, not just the quality. The big data can be very messy, so it can take a lot of time to organize this data, and at some point it might you might think, is it worth the effort of cleaning the data if we can also get information through more conventional ways? But it also has to do with this reliability of the data, and we actually have a section on politicized data, because in the end data can contain bias. It can be politicized. So in that sense, data quality and interpretation, we have looked into that, and is a very important point to bear in mind. And I think the best way to counter it is to really understand what you are measuring with the data, where the data comes from, who collects it. And this awareness, again, I think it has to do with some sort of capacity building on the level of maybe the managerial level or the level of the diplomat, to know what is being collected and what is being analyzed. It also has to do with data privacy and security, because you don't want external forces to alter your data or to modify the analysis. So data integrity is a concept in this area, to keep data the way it was originally collected. So yeah, we looked into this issue, and And in general, the way in which our report is structured is that we look at the opportunities, we look at the organizational considerations, but we also look at these things to bear in mind, the challenges to bear in mind, to really understand what is it that big data can do and what is it that big data cannot do, or what needs to be taken into account when dealing with big data.
So much. I mean, one of the interesting things I found was the argument that when we're dealing with big data, it is different from traditional statistics in the sense that statistics will take a sample, for example, will take a representative sample that then is ideally representing the kind of group of people or the issue you're interested in. With big data, the argument usually is that you're not sampling, but you're taking the whole sample, you're taking everything in at once. And people often use this as an argument to say this basically means that we do not need to be concerned about small errors because we're looking at the whole thing, and these things can be filtered out through analysis. And we do not need to be concerned about, for example, fake news as much as if we were doing normal statistical analysis. And relating fake news to social media, for example, there's a big concern about fake social media accounts, about bots, or about fake profiles, basically that kind of steer public opinion. One of the ideas would be here that with big data analysis, this is something we have to worry less about. But then again, it depends. It depends on what kind of analysis you're doing exactly and how these things play out. Barbara, you already mentioned the report a little bit. Would you like to give us a broader overview of what the report really is about and some of the key findings we have, because we have been quiet so far on this point?
Of course, we have already mentioned quite a lot of challenges, but we haven't really gone into depth in terms of the opportunities. So maybe here's a maybe more uplifting story about what big data actually could do. So as I already said before, we have looked into different areas of diplomacy, and we kind of mapped them against big data and see what would be possible. And out of that, we distilled a number of main lessons or main contributions that big data could make in the field of diplomacy. The first is that big data could provide new information and it could challenge bias, and is particularly relevant for information gathering and policy research. And an example of this is data mining of text and transcripts, reports. This can provide useful information in how topics are discussed, how this discussion changes over time and might be different in different places or among different stakeholders. And this can be very useful to better prepare a response. The second is that big data could help better understand people's perceptions and behavior. And this is particularly relevant for communication and public diplomacy, negotiation. And an example of this, and this is probably one of the better known examples of big data analysis, is sentiment analysis on social media, understanding how people talk about topics. The third is meeting the expectations of government service delivery. And we've seen in the private sector that one of the main promises of big data is exactly related to service delivery. But diplomacy traditionally doesn't really engage in extensive service delivery, except for the consular department, and here, especially when it has a lot an extensive e-government dimension, it can fine-tune the service delivery, better respond to questions, maybe automate things in this area, but also in terms of emergency to better provide support. The fourth area is tracking programs and progress over time and space. So this is particularly relevant for trade and development. Now that everything in modern society is being done online, including, for example, banking, you can quite easily track bank transfers over the world to better have a sense of economic development and trade and the use of resources by different groups in society. The same goes for measuring these sustainable development goals. There's an enormous amount of data needed to measure them. There are more than 230 indicators, and some of it can be measured through newly available data, such as satellite data, or there's a case of the estimation of food prices and their fluctuation through Twitter analysis. So there's a lot that is already being experimented with in this regard. And then the fifth is to track developments over short time frames. So some big data can be made available almost in real time. And so it could be very useful for emergency response or humanitarian affairs. There's even a Twitter earthquake detection. So if a lot of people use the hashtag earthquake or in different languages, it can actually detect an earthquake, and in some cases much faster than older equipment. But also the spread of disease, for example, through measuring GPS signals on mobile phones, you can see how population spreads, and that is often reflected in the spread of epidemics. So, for example, WHO is experimenting with this kind of technology. And then the last thing that we are looking into is identifying new forms of evidence and accountability, and this may be relevant for international law. This is a very much an emerging area, and there are no firm cases and insights yet, except for some cases in satellite data and the use of satellite data as evidence in international courts, for example. But they're here, and maybe this is a good area where Yolanda's question becomes really relevant, because how do you verify that the data, for example, a satellite image, is accurate? On the one hand, it could provide more objective, or at least seemingly objective information. But at the same time, there are huge issues, technical issues in verifying satellite data or verifying social media posts or these kind of pieces of information. So these are the possibilities, and maybe this balances the discussion a little bit more. We've already talked about how the obstacles to achieving these possibilities, but the possibilities are there, and it because there is already so much information and data generated, it would almost be a pity not to explore using it.
Thank you for adding this very important balance to the picture, because we have these two sides that we constantly need to juxtapose: the kind of skepticism that is needed, but also the approach that allows us to look at the benefits and try to work with the benefits or the potential of big data. You mentioned a couple of examples from the development sector, which current or humanitarian crisis response, which is one of the areas we found where there are already quite a number of examples, and quite a number of examples that are also well developed and written about. UN Global Pulse, for example, has a lot of information about this and has experimented a lot with these kind of ideas. So if you could take one of the examples you mentioned of the use of big data in this area and guide us a little bit more through about in terms of when does big data come into this picture, and what does big data achieve in this particular case?
Well, I think one of the best examples in which kind of the full spectrum of possibilities and opportunities and constraints becomes clear is the monitoring of epidemics through GPS data. This is something that, so UN Global Pulse has been in on this. There are also a couple of NGOs that have looked at it, and WHO has looked at it in the Ebola crisis. There's one example from Haiti. There was a cholera epidemic in 2010, and retrospectively they thought, okay, could we have predicted this earlier, and could we have the spread of this disease predicted earlier using mobile phone data? So in this case, there was an NGO that partnered with a mobile operator, and they gave them anonymized data on GPS movements or movements of populations across Haiti from that first contaminated area to the rest of Haiti. And they checked whether this compared well to the actual spread of the disease, and they saw that it was very accurate, and that it is very that it could have been predicted and the response could have been made more effective having that information. And then you can really save lives. At the same time, this information is very sensitive. So issues like privacy become very, very important. But also the quality of the data. If you have a population that maybe doesn't use mobile phones as much, or only very wealthy segments of the society use this technology that you are measuring, then you don't have an accurate image of what is happening, because you only know about subgroups in society. So I think this is a really interesting example of something that has enormous potential, because really you can better respond against an epidemic, but at the same time you need to do it responsibly.
That's a really interesting example. Having said that, it only touches on one part of what a foreign ministry does, and it kind of brings us back to this question of perhaps what is the organizational culture in a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and maybe does this organizational culture kind of rub against the idea of bringing big data in? There's an interesting comment again from Yolanda Spies, and she says, I'm just going to read it. It seems as though the phenomenon of big data hinges on quantitative proliferation of information and its sources. And here we absolutely agree. And she says, for diplomats, and she is a former diplomat, now scholar, for diplomats, the qualitative aspect is key, and therefore the challenge to access, sift, contextualize, analyze, and add value to existing data is becoming even more intense. And that's an interesting dichotomy between the organizational culture of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which we experienced as more tending towards qualitative data, towards the importance of narrative. And then on the other hand, this question of big data, which is qualitative in nature, and which kind of almost perhaps can be perceived as the opposite of these qualitative criteria. If you could say a little bit about that, how this can be mitigated, or how we think in the report that this can be mitigated, because it is one of the challenges that we have come up against, and we heard from our interviewees, and that we are trying to propose a solution to.
The dichotomy between kind of data-driven insights and expert insight is something that we look more closely at, especially because some organizations, especially in the private sector, try to become more data-driven. So data is driving almost all the decisions. This is, of course, not something that can translate into diplomacy. But at the same time, so we see big data as really something that can be complementary to expert insights. I mean, expert insights can be also flawed and biased, and one of the points of big data is to point out this bias, or to provide another insight, maybe to confirm ideas, or corroborate information. So we see it really as something complementary, where things can be interesting, and one of our interviewees pointed out this example, is when in a Ministry of Foreign Affairs you get an outcome of a big data analysis that might contradict what an expert thinks, then that is an interesting situation. Do you trust the data? Do you trust the expert? And I think there it is really important to understand, well, once more, where does the data come from? How has it been analyzed? And maybe it is a more valid source of information. Maybe it is not in that context. And at the same time, it is complementary, as expert insight is needed to contextualize insights of studies, and to make them usable. I mean, outcomes of studies are only so much unless you use them for the purpose of diplomacy.
Very much. I think that's a very important point to make, that we're not talking, there might be a perceived dichotomy, but actually we're trying to overcome this dichotomy by saying that big data, especially in this context, can only ever be complementary, and has to be complemented by expert insight. This leads me to a question from Maria Rosa Gamara, I think, if I pronounce this correctly, I hope. If not, my apologies. She says that especially in the era, for example, of the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot about measuring, a lot about we need to have data in order to assess what is going on and then can make better informed decisions. And she herself, she says she's working in this area. But her question is, how can people in diplomacy reach the best quality of data without a high level of knowledge in this field? And if I understood correctly, her concern especially comes from the fact that to get quality data, to collect quality data and to analyze that data, especially when we're talking about big data, it requires substantial resources. So what are the challenges here, and what are potential ways of mitigating this question of how do we even get at quality data and quality data analysis when we're not the data scientists ourselves?
That's a very valid question. And this is, of course, something that is also very relevant for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? You don't want something that only that you need to spend a lot of resources on if it doesn't give anything back compared to more traditional analysis. Yes, you need data scientists to analyze big data. I think that is something you cannot really get around. But you might be able to do this in partnerships, for example, with universities. Of course, you can hire a big data expert. You can partner with the private sector, and sometimes they are willing to engage in partnerships that are mutually beneficial. For example, I know that one of the foreign ministries that we looked at and we interviewed, they are partnering with IBM, and IBM provides software that is they get trials free of charge and also assistance through IBM to better conduct their analysis. So there is sometimes willingness from organizations to partner and to help, and I think this can definitely be explored.
One of the concerns is, of course, that if we enter this era of big data again, we will have something like the digital divide again popping up because it requires so many resources and additional resources that might not be available to, or that are surely not available to every Ministry of Foreign Affairs. One interesting point that Ossi mentioned in the beginning on partnerships, but also partnerships maybe across ministries, partnerships between countries. This might be a very important factor here for the future to bridge potential capacity gaps in data analysis, big data analysis. We only have 5 minutes left. So what I would like to do is to give the floor back to you, Barbara, for any final words, for maybe the final conclusion that also wraps up our findings from the report. So the floor is yours.
No, I hope that you have gotten a little bit of a taste of data diplomacy and big data for diplomacy, and I hope we didn't discourage you too much, because I think a lot is possible. And if we are entering into an era that is defined by data and a massive generation of data, I think it will be only natural if eventually a Ministry of Foreign Affairs will adapt to the new possibilities of today. Of course, this needs to be done in a responsible way, in a logical, sustainable way, and we are proposing some ways to do this. I think it also opens up a lot of other new questions that might be very interesting to explore. For example, artificial intelligence. This big data feeds into artificial intelligence. What will be the future of diplomacy in the artificial intelligence era? So maybe this is a report for a couple of years. But in the end, you know, whether it is the telegraph or the telephone or the internet or now big data, I'm quite sure that diplomacy always adapts to the environment in which it finds itself in order to pursue its objectives. And I think that will be no different in the big data era.
Thank you so much. I think these are very, very important concluding words. For the final minutes of the webinar, it is my pleasure to share the report with you, because we've been talking about the report for a whole hour now, but now you can also access the report. I just shared the link in the chat box. So please have a look, get back to us with any questions or comments. The next web debate will happen as usual on the first Tuesday next month, so the first Tuesday in March, which I also believe is also the 6th of March. Until then, I would like to thank Barbara very warmly for taking the time to introduce us to some of the key findings of the report, which is not an easy task given the breadth but also the depth of the topic and some of the controversies associated with that. Also, again, let me thank Ossi Pironen for being with us today, which he added very important insights regarding the professional perspective from a professional diplomat. We hope you enjoy the report, and we hope it makes a contribution to adding some clarity regarding the question of big data in diplomacy. So thank you so much, Barbara. And if you have any questions or comments for us, please don't hesitate to get in touch.
And thank you, participants,
Thank you
for your questions.
Yes, thank you for the audience and some very,
And
very
if
good
you're in
questions.
Geneva, we're launching it here on Thursday. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. See you next time.